Okie dokie smokies. So today we are going to look at the most insane, in the membrane, crazy, loony, unbelievable year in American history, 1968. 1968, quite possibly the most significant, the most important year in American history that's not 1776, right? And you know what happened in 1776, the Declaration of Independence and all that. So 1968 is just an insane in the membrane year. It's one crazy thing after another, after another, after another, after another, after another. It's just crazy the amount of crazy bad stuff that happens in 1968. So let's get into it. All right. So first off, Vietnam. Vietnam has just spiraled out of control by 1968. U.S. combat troops are not committed to Vietnam until 1965. Right now, we were involved in Vietnam going back to 1954. We're sending a lot of money and we're sending a lot of military advisors to Vietnam, advising the South Vietnamese government, which is non-communist, how to fight this war against the communists from North Vietnam. And we've sent more advisors and we've sent more money over time. When Lyndon Johnson is elected president in 1964, Lyndon Johnson comes to believe that, one, the United States cannot lose another country to communism. For him politically, for his political future and the Democratic Party's political future, they can't allow Vietnam to fall to the communists. They have to do everything they can to stop that from happening. And Johnson comes to believe that the only way, by 1964, the only way to stop this from happening, to stop Vietnam from completely collapsing to communism, is the United States had to take over the fighting of this war. So in 1965, Johnson gets Congress to allow him to begin sending in combat troops. And the United States begins actually sending in combat troops in 1965 to fight the war in Vietnam and to stop the communists from taking over. And this war rapidly begins to spiral from that point on because we send in 63,000 troops and then it's 85,000 troops and then it's 105,000 troops. And it just keeps adding up. We just keep sending more and more and more and more and more troops to Vietnam. Now, up to 1968, the United States government had been telling the American people, this war is all but over. This war is almost done. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel. We are near the end of this war. The United States is about to win, and we're going to stop the spread of communism. And up to January of 1968, the American people supported the United States involvement in Vietnam. The American people, for the most part, thought Vietnam was the right thing to do. That all changes with the Tet Offensive in January of 1968. The Tet Offensive is what turns American opinion against Vietnam. The Tet Offensive is what really begins to ramp up the protests against Vietnam. The Tet Offensive is what changes everything in Vietnam. So here's what's happening. Tet is the name for the Vietnamese New Year in 1968. So like the Chinese New Year, the year of the dragon, the year of the dog, the year of the pig, the year of the rooster, so on and so forth. The Vietnamese people name their years as well. And 1968 is the year of Tet. And it's a big celebration in Vietnam. It's a time of gathering, and it's a time of feast, and it's a time of partying, and so on and so forth, as you welcome in the new year. So the United States and North Vietnam, the communists, sign a truce. to allow the Vietnamese people to celebrate Tet. And during this period of Tet, where they're celebrating the new year, there will be no fighting. So American troops just kind of relax. They know for the next week or so, they're not going to die, which is a good thing. So they're relaxed and so on and so forth. Now, because of this truce, many people from the rural areas around the big cities, and the big cities in South Vietnam is where the United States really control everything. Saigon and places like that, right? The Vietnamese communists had never been able to get into the big cities because the United States controlled them so well. So during Tet, people from the surrounding hillsides and rural areas take this truce as an opportunity to bury their dead. And they begin to bring their dead into these big cities in South Vietnam so they could have a proper burial. So there's all of these coffins flooding into the city with all of these people from the rural area. Now, coming with these peasants who are coming in, the rural area people, coming in with them are communist uh, guerrilla rebel fighters. They're called the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong are the real problem in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese army is pretty terrible, and the United States can take them on with no problem at all. In fact, all they were doing was just fighting the North Vietnamese army, the NVA. The United States would have this war over very quickly. But then there's the Viet Cong, and the Viet Cong are just peasants. They're just regular people who happen to have a gun, and they support the communist cause. They don't wear a uniform, a military uniform. They don't represent necessarily the North Vietnamese army. They don't have any identification that would identify them as communists. They just look like regular people. And the Viet Cong, or the VC is what they're known as, caused real problems because they look like everybody else, and they will pass the United States on the streets and so on and so forth, and soldiers will just think, oh, it's just a peasant, and they'll disappear in the jungle, and all of a sudden they open up fire on the soldiers. And the United States doesn't know how to fight this type of war, right? This guerrilla war. They're used to traditional standard fighting from World War I and World War II, and maybe even a little bit Korea. That's what they're used to. And now they're just getting attacked in these guerrilla attacks by plainclothed people who go off in the jungles and open fire on them. So the VC are the real problems here. Coming in with all these peasants who are bringing in coffins filled with bodies of their dead relatives that they can give a proper burial. Many of these people coming in are VC, Viet Cong, and these coffins are filled with weapons. And for the first time, they're able to get into these large American-held cities. And all of a sudden, in the middle of the Tet truce, the Viet Cong launch an all-out assault on the American troops, breaking this truce, and this is known as the Tet Offensive. Now, the United States, completely caught off guard because they're not expecting this. Eventually, the United States gains the upper hand and is able to push the VC out. Militarily, this is a victory for the United States military because they hold on to these main cities and they actually gain some territory during this offensive by the Viet Cong. Politically, it's a disaster. This is where the United States people go, this war is not anywhere close to being over. This war is not even remotely done. We're not anywhere near the end. If we were near the end, there's no way the enemy could carry out an attack like this. And it becomes very apparent to the American people that the American government, the Lyndon Johnson government, has been lying to them, that this war is not about over. And we just keep sending more and more and more and more troops. By 1968, we have over 500,000 troops. 500,000 American soldiers are in Vietnam fighting. And the American people go, this is this is everything about this war is wrong, and things begin to quickly spiral from there. Making matters worse was this execution. This is an execution that was played live on TV. This is a South Vietnamese soldier who is shooting a Viet Cong. You can see he's just plainclothed person. He executes this Viet Cong soldier live on TV. Woof. And that doesn't play well in American households. This is known as the living room war. And this is one of the things, the living room war is one of the things that begins to turn the American people against this war as well. This is known as a living room war because it's a war that seemingly is fought in the front rooms, the living rooms of Americans across the United States. TV is still fairly new. It's 15 years old or so. And it will be the first war that will be broadcast live on TV. Most Americans have never been in combat. The closest to most Americans have ever been to combat is what they see on the movies. And now for the first time, Americans are able to watch the horrors of war live on TV. They can see what actual combat looks like. And they see that Viet Cong soldier executed live on TV. And when Americans see these images live on their TV in their living rooms, in their homes in the United States, a lot of Americans really begin to lose their appetite for the war. Americans, there are accounts of Americans who saw their sons, their brothers, their fathers, their boyfriends, their husbands killed live on TV. And that really begins to help turn the tide against the war when people can see the actual horrors of the war and what actual war really looks like. Because of this experience and how it helped turn public opinion against the war, it is now against the law. The government does not allow live broadcasts of the war to be shown. Right? Reporters cannot actually go out into the battlefield and do a live broadcast from the battlefield. That is no longer allowed. And it happens because of this experience here and the fact that it helped turn Americans against the war. So that's January of 1968. Further turning Americans against the war is the next event that takes place in March of 1968. And this is, I am, for the most part, I am an American exceptionalist. Okay, I truly believe that the United States is a very special, unique place in the world. I truly believe in the United States. I believe in this unique experiment, right? And I have a lot of pride in being an American. But that doesn't mean that the United States hasn't done some bad things. We've done some horrifically awful, terrible things in America. We're not the saints that sometimes we like to think we are, right? We have a terrible history with slavery and the inherent racism that comes with that. Our experiences with the American Indians, so on and so forth. This next event is one of the most horrific, one of the most unforgivable, one of the most disgusting moments in American history. And it, again, just further pushes people away from this war. And that's My Lai. My Lai is a horrible, horrible event. So here's what happens. March 16th, 1968, some American soldiers are out on just routine patrol doing what they call search and destroy missions. And search and destroy missions are exactly what they sound like. These American soldiers would go into these little villages all around Vietnam, and they would have all the villagers come out of their huts while they interrogated the villagers, asking them if they knew of Viet Cong, in the area of Viet Cong activity, if there were Viet Cong that were using the village as some sort of base or camp, right? And so as they're interrogating the villagers, other soldiers would go from hut hut to hut to hut to hut, looking for evidence of Viet Cong activity or Viet Cong intelligence. If it was found that this village had VC in it, or if there was Viet Cong intelligence, whatever, the soldiers would burn the village to the ground. They would destroy the village, and then they would go on to the next village, right? If they didn't find any evidence, they would just go on and leave the villagers alone. But they come to this little village of My Lai in March of 1968. And these soldiers, who are probably increasingly frustrated with this war, they're fighting an enemy that they can't see. They don't really understand what their mission is. They don't really seem to be making any headway. People in the United States are beginning to turn against them. So all this frustration begins to build up, and a mob mentality takes place. And the soldiers, absolutely, the American soldiers absolutely unleash hell on earth for these people in My Lai. Over the course of the next several hours in this afternoon, March afternoon of 1968, the American soldiers that go into My Lai absolutely massacre this village. Hundreds of villagers are massacred. Little children, who, if you've ever seen children get very scared and they just kind of, and they run all over the place, and they kind of run, with no direction. They're just running because they're scared. American soldiers use those children as target practice, and many of them take a knee in some of the little roads there in the village and shoot at the children as they're running through the village as target practice, just picking them off. Girls as young as 8, women as old as probably in their 70s or 80s, they think, were brutally, savagely, repeatedly raped by the American soldiers. Many of their bodies were then mutilated in various ways after being raped. It was just horrific that takes place. And this takes place over the course of several hours. And you can see, in one of the pictures there's some journalists who are with them. So they're the ones, this is how the story gets out, because there were journalists who were traveling with these soldiers on the search and destroy mission, and they took pictures of what was happening. And then they wrote stories about what was happening. And you can see some of the villagers there in the lower right-hand corner of the screen hiding in a ditch, in an irrigation ditch, from the American soldiers, hoping not to be killed. There's a grandmother trying to protect her family. And this was a road leading out of My Lai that a bunch of villagers were running down this road, and the American soldiers came and opened fire on the villagers as they were running. Now, My Lai only comes to an end when an American chopper pilot, American helicopter pilot, is just doing a routine patrol around the jungle, and he sees all of this chaos taking place in My Lai. So he's watching what's happening. And he sees a group of children, small children, running down this road from My Lai. And he sees these soldiers begin to line up across the road and setting up their weapons as they're about to open fire on these children who are running away. And this American chopper pilot lands his helicopter between the kids and the soldiers, and he points all of his weaponry. And these helicopters are pretty heavily armored. He points all of his armor, all of his weapons at the American soldiers, and announces on his loudspeaker outside of the chopper, "The first person to open fire, I will open fire on all of you." And at that point, the soldiers packed up and just left. Had it not been for that American chopper pilot, this would have been much, much worse than it already was. Eventually, of course, the story gets out, and the commander of these troops, Lieutenant William Calley, is arrested, put on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Okay. Now, he's put on trial in a military court. Military court works much different than civilian courts. In a military court, the trials tend to go much quicker, and the penalties tend to be much more harsh. If Lieutenant William Calley is found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, he could be executed by firing squad. If he's found guilty, he will be executed by if he is sentenced to execution by firing squad. It will be done within 48 hours of that verdict. Well, Lieutenant William Calley is found guilty. He is not sentenced to execution. He is sentenced to life of hard labor in a military prison camp. Basically, he's going to take a big rock and he's going to break it into little rocks. And then he's going to move those piles of little rocks all over the prison yard. That's his sentence. He's going to do that for the rest of his life. So he's sentenced to that in 1973. 1981, Lieutenant William Calley is released from military prison for good behavior and so on. And he is today, he owns a jewelry store in Dayton, Ohio. So there you go. Horrific, awful, awful event happens in March of 1968. Yikes! So as Vietnam is spinning out of control, and it is very apparent that the United States government has been lying to the American people that this war is nowhere near over. It's becoming a meat grinder as more and more young men are being sent off to an all-expense-paid trip in Vietnam for their senior trip, and it's just not going well. College campuses across the country erupt in protest. And they're calling attention to the inequities and the problems in the war, but they're also in many ways, making the problem worse. Young men could go to college to avoid the draft. The law was as long as you were in school, you couldn't be drafted. You got a deferment and you were not eligible to be drafted till you're out of college. So what was beginning to happen is that these young men were going into college and they would be there for years. They would be about ready to graduate and then they would change their major. So they'd have to stay in later, or they'd go to graduate college, graduate school or whatever, right? Just to avoid the draft. Now, who can afford to do that, right? Mostly upper middle class rich kids. Who are most of the upper middle class rich kids? They're mostly white. So what's beginning to happen because of that? This war, because these guys can't be drafted, this war is beginning to be taken over and fought by poor whites and or minorities. Increasingly, this is a war fought by the lower poor white class, as well as Black and Hispanic young kids. Oof. Many of these young men would burn their draft cards, have these public displays where they would burn their draft cards, which is a federal offense. Many of them, in order to avoid the war, would go to Canada, or they would go to Mexico, or they would go to England to avoid the draft, right? And again, upper middle class, rich kids are the ones who can go to Canada and go to Mexico and go to England to live. And again, most of those are white. And so somebody's got to fill their role. So increasingly, this war is being fought by poor white and or minority students. As the war becomes more and more fought by minorities, the civil rights movement, particularly the African American civil rights movement, becomes very, very radicalized. They become very angry and frustrated with what's happening. And it begins to get radicalized by this guy, Malcolm X, who fights for the civil rights of African Americans. He joins the Nation of Islam. You can see the ring there. He's got the Nation of Islam ring. and he adopts a lot of the ideology of the Nation of Islam, which is very black nationalistic. They believe that blacks are superior and whites are inferior. All other races are inferior to the black race. Um, and they argue for a segregated society. And Malcolm X becomes the antithesis to Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King is about passive protest and working to get people voted and then get those people to vote. Malcolm X is saying, I'm not necessarily for voting, for getting people to vote, right? He goes, voting takes a long time, and we've had a right to vote for 100 years, and not much has changed. Malcolm X's famous quote is, bullets work faster than ballots. And Malcolm X begins to radicalize the civil rights movement at this point. Now, this is the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s. Malcolm X, around 1963, has a kind of a change of attitude. And he begins to move away from that very, very radical belief of the Nation of Islam, and begins moving more and more towards what Malcolm X or what Martin Luther King was talking about. And he begins to talk about racial harmony and integration and so on and so forth. When he begins to make that transformation in 1963, he's then assassinated on stage in New York City while he's giving a speech by other members of the Nation of Islam. But his efforts to radicalize the civil rights movement begins to pick up speed in the late 1960s as the Vietnam War is becoming increasingly a war of young Black and Hispanic men who are fighting the war. And we begin to get displays of Black power and Black nationalism. This is from the 1968 Summer Olympics. These are two American sprinters who won the gold and the bronze medal. And during the playing of the national anthem, to show their anger and their frustration with the plight of minorities in the United States, and to show their support for Black power during the playing of the national anthem, instead of placing their hand over their heart, they put black gloves on their fist and raised their hands in the air, which was the sign of Black power. That act cost them their medals. They were stripped of their medals by the United States Olympic Committee. Very much like when Colin Kaepernick was taking a knee during the national anthem. That's essentially the same thing that happens here. And then you get the formation of an actual political party, arguing, kind of pushing this Black power idea, the Black Panther Party. They actually begin running candidates for public office. Okay, and the United States views the Black Panther Party as a bunch of communists who are, trying to overthrow the United States and so on and so forth. So the civil rights movement is beginning to unravel. College campuses are a hotbed of protest. I mean, things are really beginning to spin crazily in 1968. Which is not good news for Lyndon Johnson, President Lyndon Johnson. President Lyndon Johnson, of course, becomes president. He was vice president for John Kennedy in 1963. He becomes president after Kennedy is killed. He's then elected to his own presidency in 1964. And Lyndon Johnson, all the way up to 1968, was a fairly popular president. He had passed this massive expansion of the New Deal, the Great Society, bringing in programs such as welfare and Medicaid and Medicare, and this massive social legislation that there was an expansion or an add-on to the New Deal of the 1930s. Very popular. He passed several major civil rights bills, the Civil Rights Act 1963, the Voting Rights Act of 1964. So he had really done a lot to expand civil rights across the country, but Vietnam just kept coming back. And by 1968, it was beginning to really wear on Lyndon Johnson. There are kids, there are protesters outside of the White House every day with bullhorns, and Lyndon Johnson could hear them when he was in the White House chanting over and over and over and over all day long. Hey, hey, ho, ho, LBJ, how many kids you killed today? Hey, hey, ho, ho, LBJ, how many kids you killed today? So that's beginning to wear on him. And then, you know, me or the Tet Offensive happens, exposing that what Lyndon Johnson and his government have been telling the American people was not true at all. Then Me Lie, and it's just really beginning to grind and wear on him. And Lyndon Johnson is increasingly becoming a very, very unpopular president. So unpopular, in fact, that in 1968, not one, but two major Democratic candidates will challenge Lyndon Johnson for the Democratic nomination. Now, this is like the ultimate sign of disrespect. This is the ultimate diss. When your own party, when prominent, powerful members of your own political party challenge you for your party's nomination when you're the incumbent, right? That just doesn't happen. That's the ultimate sign of disrespect. Nobody in the Republican Party of note challenged Donald Trump in 2020 for the Republican nomination. Nobody challenged in the Democratic Party challenged Barack Obama for the Democratic nomination in 2016, right? Nobody challenged George W. Bush for the Republican nomination in 2004, right? It's just not, you just don't do it, right? It's just the ultimate sign of respect. And now, 1968, because of Vietnam just rapidly spinning out of control and the social unrest and just the craziness that's taking place, not one but two Democratic politicians are going to challenge Lyndon Johnson for the nomination. Hubert Humphrey and Robert F. Kennedy, brother of John Kennedy. This leads to a shocking, unbelievable moment. Oh, this is crazy. What's about to happen here? Lyndon Johnson goes on TV to give a public address. He's going to address the American people about Vietnam. And at the end of the speech, this is March 31st, 1968, and there's Lyndon Johnson. March 31st, 1968, Lyndon Johnson is on live TV addressing the American people about Vietnam. At the end of his speech, Lyndon Johnson says something that nobody knew was coming. None of his advisors, none of his cabinet, nobody except Lyndon Johnson, probably his wife, knew was going to happen. At the end of this speech, Lyndon Johnson looks at the camera and he tells the American people that he will not seek nor will he accept the Democratic nomination for president in 1968. What? What? The dude just quit. He's not going to run. When does this happen? When does a president just, when he has a chance to be reelected, when does a president say, nah? Lyndon Johnson just did it because the war and everything had just kind of ground him down. Ugh. Holy cow. So we're like 4 months in, right? We're at the end of March. We've had three major events that in any other year would be the story of the year. Holy cow. 1968 can't get any more crazy. Oh, just wait. A few days later, April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King has gone to Memphis to support a garbage worker strike. Garbage workers in Memphis were almost all African American. They were extraordinarily underpaid. And Martin Luther King felt like he was beginning to lose. Well, he didn't feel like he had begun to lose control of the civil rights movement. Right, he was in a lot of circles. Martin Luther King had kind of seen as a has-been, that he wasn't relevant in the civil rights movement anymore. And he saw this as an opportunity to kind of regain control of the civil rights movement and to give the civil rights movement new life and new direction. So he goes to Memphis to support this garbage workers strike. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King staying at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, and he had just come out. He's getting ready to go to dinner. And there's a picture of him with some of his advisors. They were just getting ready to go to dinner, and there were some people in the parking lot, and he was waving to the people and talking with them as he's going to dinner. And then shot rings out, striking Martin Luther King in the neck, killing him. And there's a picture right after the shot was fired. Oh my gosh. What? That's crazy, right? Now it ends up he is shot by a guy who was kind of across the street with a high-powered rifle. And he shot Martin Luther King, who was eventually arrested, and he was a member of the KKK. Oh boy. This sparks off massive riots across the United States, in Denver, in Detroit, in Chicago, in Washington, D.C., Los Angeles. There's massive riots following the assassination of Martin Luther King. Whoa! Holy cow! It can't get any crazier, right? We've got the Tet Offensive and the My Lai Massacre and the massive protest and the social unrest and the radicalization of the civil rights movement and the Democratic Party challenging Lyndon Johnson and then Lyndon Johnson quitting and now Martin Luther King being killed. It can't get any crazier, can it? Oh, just wait! 2 months later, to the day, June 4th, 1968, Robert Kennedy has just won the very, very important Democratic primary in California, essentially guaranteeing that he will be the Democratic nominee for president in 1968. He was an extraordinarily popular candidate. He had broad support, and everything seems to indicate not only is he going to win the Democratic nomination, he's probably going to win the presidency fairly easily. So there he is in Los Angeles announcing that he had just won the Democratic primary, essentially guaranteeing that he will be the candidate for the Democratic Party in 1968. And in that picture, he's saying, now let's on to Chicago, which is where the Democratic National Convention will be taking place. It's on to Chicago, and let's win there. About 30 seconds after this photograph is taken, Robert Kennedy is walking through the kitchen of this hotel on his way up to his hotel room when an assassin shot Robert Kennedy in the head. And this is a picture of Bobby Kennedy on the floor of the kitchen after being shot. The student who shot him was a Palestinian student at UCLA who was not happy with Robert Kennedy and his support of Israel. And so he shot Bobby Kennedy as he was walking through the kitchen of this hotel, the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, killing Bobby Kennedy. What? This year can't get any crazier. This is lunacy. How can this be happening? Whoa! Gosh, this is crazy. It can't get crazier, can it? Yes, it can. Oh. Week of June 28, 1968, Chicago, Illinois. This is where the Democratic National Convention is going to be. This is the big meeting of Democrats from around the country. And they're coming to Chicago in 1968 to formally choose their candidate for president in 1968. No longer going to be Bobby Kennedy, obviously. And also to determine what their platform, what their message is going to be to voters in 1968. So all these Democrats from all over the country are arriving in Chicago to choose their candidate and to set their agenda, their beliefs. Yay! Arriving with them are some organizers of what are known as the New Left, young, uh, kind of radical, I guess, for the time, um, students who want the United States to get out of Vietnam, but also the United States to do all sorts of other social programs. This is Tom Hayden. He was one of the leaders. Then Abbie Hoffman. That's a picture of Abbie Hoffman. Abbie Hoffman is a very interesting person. There's a Netflix movie that's up for Best Picture, Trial of the Chicago Seven. It's mostly about Abbie Hoffman, but also about Tom Hayden. And it's about what we're about to talk about, the 1968 Democratic Convention. They're here to discredit, embarrass the Democratic Party. That's their mission, is to just make the Democratic Party look foolish and call them out for what they see as their failure to the American people. Now, the mayor of Chicago is this guy. His name is Richard Daley. And Richard Daley ran Chicago like a dictator. There was nothing that happened in Chicago that he didn't know about and he didn't allow. He ran it with an iron fist. And Mayor Daley is a loyal Democrat. And there is no way, he is bound and determined that these hippies, these young, radical, stinky hippies, are not going to destroy his convention. So, Mayor Daley has every single member of the Democratic or every single member of the Chicago Police Department on duty this week to put down these hippies. He calls in the Illinois National Guard to deal with these hippies because arriving with the thousands of delegates, the thousands of people who are going to attend the Democratic convention and choose their nominee and put forth their message, arriving with them are also tens of thousands of protesters. Hippies. Whoa. So he's bound and determined to keep the peace here. And at first, it's pretty peaceful. There's, some kind of minor standoffs between the protesters and the police and the military and the National Guard, but nothing really serious. They're letting they let the protesters camp out in all these parks quite a ways away, many miles away from downtown Chicago where the convention is taking place. They just didn't want them around. They didn't want them to be seen. They can do their protesting and do whatever they want to do out in the parks. And so the things are pretty calm. As the convention progresses and we get closer and closer to the moment where they're going to choose their candidate, things begin to heat up and the clashes begin to get a little more violent and the clashes begin to get a little more heated. More arrests, more riots begin to take place as the convention progresses. Okay, now in 1968, there are three channels essentially to watch. There's no cable TV. You have ABC, NBC, CBS. And during the Republican and during the Democratic national conventions, they would show the conventions from the time they began in the afternoon till the time they ended sometime that night. There was nothing else to watch, right? So if you're watching TV, you're watching the conventions, right? There was no other choice. And as we get to the night where they're going to formally nominate their candidate, and their candidate's going to come out and accept a nomination and give their speech, yes, I accept it, and here's what we're going to do, more and more people watch throughout the week, right? They want to see who gets nominated, they want to see what they have to say, so on and so forth. In the convention hall, tensions begin to heat up between the delegates, the people who are at the Democratic Convention. There are some in the Democratic Convention who want the Democratic Party to come out and say any and all wars are bad and we're going to get out of Vietnam, period. Right immediately, right this second, we're getting out of Vietnam and all wars are bad. The other delegates, most of the other delegates in the Democratic National Convention go, I don't think we're really ready to do that, right? Vietnam, we probably should get out, but we're not willing to say all wars are bad. And that leads to tensions on the floor of the Democratic National Convention, and fistfights begin to break out. We have Donnybrooks breaking out, slobber knockers breaking out on the floor of the Democratic National Convention. And it's being seen live on TV. What? Holy smokes! This is insane. The delegates begin shouting and screaming at each other as fists are flying. Meanwhile, outside in front of the convention center, the protesters have fought and pushed the police back to the convention center, and they're just beating. The police are beating on them, and they're fighting back. And the police are, whack-a-mole, beating on the protesters with their batons and arresting them. And the protesters are throwing balloons filled with paint and urine, woof, at the police, right? They're throwing pee bombs at the police and the National Guard. There's riots breaking out inside the convention center over who their candidate's going to be, and they want a no war. Well, war is probably not good, but we're not going to say we're never going to get in a war, right? So there's fights between those people. There's riots breaking out in front of the convention center. Yikes! This is insane. And it's being shown live on TV. Live on TV. The Democratic Party is imploding with riots outside and inside and yelling and fighting and just chaos. Finally, well after midnight, order is restored outside of the convention center and inside the convention center. And they eventually nominate Hubert Humphrey. He's the only one left running for president, right, for the Democratic Party. And they nominate Hubert Humphrey, but the damage had been done. The American people had viewed the Democratic Party just implode with riots outside of the convention center, fistfights and screaming matches inside the convention center. Mayor Daley of Chicago was being accused of inciting a riot and causing the problems, and Mayor Daley starts calling people names on live TV and challenging them to fistfights. I mean, it was just chaos. Eventually, things are restored. And Hubert Humphrey, well after midnight, is nominated as the Democratic nominee. Oh, what a crazy, crazy moment. What is happening? The following week, we have the Republican convention, 1968. There's no riots. There's no fights. There's no controversy. There's no nothing. And Richard Nixon is nominated with little problem for a second time as the Republican nominee for president. Remember, Richard Nixon makes his name as an anti-communist fighter in the late 40s into the 50s, becomes Eisenhower's vice president in 1952 and then again in 1956. He's nominated by the Republican Party in 1960 to be their candidate for president in 1960. He loses to John Kennedy. He then runs for governor of California in 1962. He lost that. He then runs for governor of California again. He wins. And then in 1968, he runs for the president of the United States, and he's nominated by the Republican Party. Very little problem. And Richard Nixon promises to restore law and order, right? He said, you saw what happened at the Democratic National Convention, and you've seen what's happened on college campuses around the country. I promise you law and order. Very appealing message to American people. Election day comes, and Nixon wins. Now, if you notice, there is a third candidate, the American Independent, mostly in the South, right down in here, right? The candidate is a former Southern governor, Henry Wallace, who is a proud and open segregationist and a racist. And he runs on the American Independent Party, and he wins 5 states. Oof. But now we got Richard Nixon as president. So Nixon, one of the things that he wants to do is end Vietnam, which is a crazy thing because he was part of the reason why we got involved in Vietnam in the first place, right? He was with Eisenhower when Eisenhower decides we got to go to Vietnam to contain the spread of communism, right? That's our focus, the Truman Doctrine, contain the spread of communism. And now it's going to be Richard Nixon who's going to say, we're getting out of Vietnam. But Nixon calls it peace with honor. And what he means is, we're going to leave Vietnam, but we're going to do so in an honorable fashion. We're not just going to pick up and go. There's nothing honorable about running away. But we're going to do this slowly. And he calls it Vietnamization. And this is really important. And here's what it means. Vietnamization means that the United States is going to slowly pull out combat troops. We're going to slowly withdraw from Vietnam. And then it's going to be up to the South Vietnamese people, the South Vietnamese army, the South Vietnamese government to continue this war. It will ultimately be up to them whether they win or they lose this war. This war is slowly going to be taken over by the Vietnamese as the United States slowly begins to leave. So that's Vietnamization, and that was Nixon's peace with honor. And he holds true to his word, slowly begins to bring down the number of combat troops from a high of over 500,000. He begins to slowly bring that number down and slowly pull American troops out of Vietnam. As he does this, the protests and the civil unrest around the country that had been focused on Vietnam really begins to die down, and college campuses become very, very calm, pretty peaceful places again. Until we get to 1970. When the winter of 1970, when it comes out, the United States has been, as we're pulling out of Vietnam, we've been doing bombing raids and attacks and fighting in Cambodia, in Laos, which are right next to Vietnam. Now, the reason for this is you can see there's what's known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a trail, a supply trail from North Vietnam, where they're supplying food and medicine and weapons to the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. And the food and weapons and medicine and so on are coming from China, and they're coming from the Soviet Union into North Vietnam, which would then be taken on the Ho Chi Minh Trail into South Vietnam. And you can see where it branches off into South Vietnam to supply the Viet Cong there. It used to go through Vietnam, but the United States, as they would bomb it, and they would discover it, and they would disrupt it, the Ho Chi Minh Trail just kept bumping further and further over until it begins going through the neighboring countries of Laos and Cambodia, which are not part of the war. They were, quote unquote, neutral. They really weren't neutral. They were, pretty much supportive of the communist Vietnamese, but they weren't involved in the war necessarily. So the United States begins bombing and going into Cambodia and Laos to try to disrupt this trail. So now, this is just so weird because as we're drawing down our involvement in Vietnam, at the same time, we're expanding the scope of the war into Cambodia and Laos. What? Well, as you can imagine, this doesn't go well in the United States, particularly on college campuses. And it brings us to a horrific event on a college campus in Ohio, Kent State. Kent State was the site of a lot of very large anti-war protests. Some buildings were burnt down on Kent State, most notably the ROTC building, which is an Army kind of a reserve officer training is what it is, where young people could join the Army but delay their enlistment into the Army while they're in college, and the government pays for them to go to college with the agreement that after college they go into the military, but they'll go in as officers and so on. So the ROTC building is burnt down on Kent State, and there's several other fairly large protests on Kent State against the war, the expansion of the war. Well, the governor of Ohio wants to make sure that no other government buildings are harmed and make sure that things don't get out of control. So he brings in the Ohio National Guard. And the Ohio National Guard is brought in to keep the peace and make sure things don't happen, crazy things don't happen. And they're protecting all these buildings and so on and so forth. And they're given orders not to fire. They are not to fire their weapons at all unless they're given the order to. Oh boy. March 4th, 1970. As students are coming out of classes, they're coming down the hill towards the Ohio National Guard. And they're yelling and screaming things. The students don't like the presence of the National Guard there. They're yelling and screaming things at them, calling them all sorts of names and so on and so forth. And the National Guard is trying to keep their lines here. And then there's a weird noise that takes place. Pretty much everybody thinks it was probably a car backfiring. But the Ohio National Guard thought it was a gunshot. And they thought one of two things had happened. One, somebody was shooting at them. Or two, the order to open fire had been given and they just didn't hear it. So the Ohio National Guard, after this, opened fire on the students. Oh boy. Killing several of the students. Oh, what is happening? In the United States, American soldiers have now opened fire and killed American citizens. What? This is crazy. Oh my goodness. Right after Kent State comes a massive scandal called the Pentagon Papers. This guy here, Daniel Ellsworth, who at one point was working with the government and became very disillusioned with how the government was operating in Vietnam. And he knew, because he was a part of it, that the United States government was lying to the American people about what was happening in Vietnam. And Daniel Ellsworth works with some people to break in to some offices that had all of these documents and all of these papers proving the United States government was making things up in Vietnam and covering things up and lying to the American people about Vietnam. So he and these other people, Daniel Ellsworth, broke into these offices and got these papers and then gave these papers to the New York Times to publish, called the Pentagon Papers. And the Pentagon Papers just showed they were documents, official government documents, in which the United States government actively engaged, knowingly engaged in misleading and lying to the American people about what was actually happening in Vietnam. And the New York Times began to publish these papers. And it just further enrages the American people at the government. The American government has now lost almost total faith in the American government. And support for Vietnam is just completely off the map. The government sues trying to stop the publishing of these papers. The Supreme Court ruled, no, these papers can be published. And the papers continue to be published. And it just further destroys confidence in the American government, as well as confidence, support for the Vietnam War. It's just insanity. So this speeds up the end of the Vietnam War. Nixon's getting close to re-election. 1972, Nixon knows that if he can end the war, it will guarantee that he will be reelected as president in 1972. So the efforts to end the war really begin to ramp up. March 29th, 1973, the last U.S. combat troops leave Vietnam. The United States combat troops are completely out of Vietnam. We still have advisors and so on and so forth left in Vietnam, but the United States is no longer actively fighting in this war. And on April 30th, 1975, the capital of South Vietnam, Hanoi, falls. And the United States completely evacuates, leaves Vietnam forever on that day. North Vietnamese communist forces roll into the streets of Hanoi. This is a picture of the United States. This is on top of the U.S. embassy there. And the United States told these South Vietnamese people who were supportive, who were friendly, who helped the United States government, who knew that if they stayed in Vietnam, they were probably going to be killed by the North Vietnamese communist forces as traitors. So the United States government was trying to get as many of these people out as we could, and that's what you see there. That is a line of South Vietnamese people trying to get into a helicopter, and that's an American soldier. It's an American soldier or a diplomat helping these South Vietnamese people. This is a ladder. Oh, snap. That's not good. See if we can get it back here. Oh, come on. But that's all those people are South Vietnamese people who needed to get out of Vietnam as the communists came in, because they knew they would be killed. And the United States didn't get them all out. The United States told them that we would get them all out, that every single one of them would be saved. And it didn't happen. Oof. So there you go. 1968 and the end of Vietnam. What a crazy time. I know it was long, but whoa, what a time. What an insane year. What just lunacy that's taking place. All right, Panthers. We'll talk to you guys later. Take care.